Well, hey, good morning and welcome again to The Journey. Glad you're with us today. Welcome to those joining us online as well. As today we're wrapping up our series about relationships. And Mark almost messed it up, but he held off. And we made it through the whole month without saying that inappropriately. Anyways, we've been talking all this month about dealing with relationships and the crap that kind of comes with that, as thus the title. And I just want to let you know, too, next week we're kicking off a brand new series called True Crimes. And we're going to be, maybe you're someone who loves like the true crime podcasts and things like that. We're going to be looking at some true crimes in the Bible and some different people and their stories and what that can mean for us today. So you might be kind of excited about that. So, but today we're wrapping up this series. And today we've been talking in this series more about kind of general issues in our relationships, things like anger and forgiveness and kind of things that go for kind of any relationship. But today we're going to be talking a little more specifically about marriage and families. And so we're going to be diving into that because that's one area where some crap kind of comes into our lives and relationships in. And so, but this week, I noticed something this week. I saw this online. I thought it was kind of funny. I think we got a little picture of it here. And so there's a guy, and he posted this. He said, "I noticed that my wife was starting to get in one of those moods. And so I asked her, 'Do you want some attention or do you want me to leave you alone?' And she responded, 'Both.' And if that's not the definition of marriage, I don't know what is." I thought that was funny. I know maybe you're a husband and you're like, is it okay to laugh at that because you're sitting next to your wife? I know you like, come on, ladies, it's pretty funny. I think that's a good one because that's just kind of how marriages works and people are different. And with a marriage, you make a vow and you make a commitment for better or for worse, right? When you get married. And in a marriage, in our families, we tend to have to deal with a lot of different issues because part of it is just proximity. Like you are always with those people, right? You're always with your family, your spouse, your kids. They're always there. And sometimes it's like, I know, tell me about it. They're always there. But that really is, they're always there. It can be a good thing, but it also can be kind of a struggle thing. And they get to see us at our best and at our worst. And as we go through life, there's different stages in our lives. And people change as we go through. And so it can just bring issues that we need to deal with in our families. I've heard some people say this, that some people think marriage is about finding your soulmate. It's really about just finding the one person that you get to annoy for the rest of your life. And so that's maybe something you can relate to. And because, man, there's just things that each other do that just begin, maybe they were cute little things and you started dating, and now they just become annoying things that we have to deal with. And so we're talking about marriage and families and dealing with the issues that come up with that. And throughout this whole series, though, we've been looking in the book of Colossians chapter 3, and we're going to be looking there again today. And as always, I want to encourage you to check out the YouVersion Bible app. And we always have resources in there for all of our series. And this week, we'll have another Bible reading plan that goes along with this week. And so you might want to check that out. You can follow along there. This is a great resource. You can have the Bible always with you on your phone. And they have a lot of other great resources too. And so always want to encourage you to check that out. But today, again, we're looking again at Colossians chapter 3. And we've been looking at this all month long. And so we're going to read it again as a way to let these words settle into our souls. And so let's look at this again. Colossians chapter 3. Verses 5, we begin. It says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to the earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming." If you missed last week because you were on midwinter break or you were sick or whatever, we talked about sex last week. It's kind of, so you missed out a little bit, but this is the verse we kind of focused on. And so, as always, you can go back and check that out. But we just talked about how that is one issue that brings a lot of struggle into our lives if we don't do it the right way. And so you might want to go back and check that out. It goes, "We used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice." We talked about that in the first week of the series, that we can end up having anger towards someone else, bitterness towards someone else, and that maybe hurt us or did things like that. And that can end up affecting our relationships with other people, not even the people we're mad at, because bitterness and anger is kind of settled in our hearts. We talked about how anger is such a part of our society these days. And so as this passage talks about later on, it talks about forgiving others as God has forgiven us. And so that was our first week of the series. It goes on to talk about slander, filthy language, and don't lie to each other in these verses. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, that our words really matter. We talked about this is the way you used to walk, as we just read in the verse, but it's also we used to talk maybe in a different way. And so our words really matter in our relationships. So again, you can always review all of those on our website, but this continues again. Don't lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and put on your new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge of the image of its creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if you have any grievances against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you're called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through the psalms, hymns, songs of the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. So we've been in this passage all month long, and this really applies to where we're going today. But as we're thinking about marriage and families, I just want to say this before we kind of continue on. If you aren't married, if you're single, man, that is okay. I know some people might put pressure on you to be like, you have to be married. When are you going to get married? When are you going to have kids or whatever? Maybe you hear that comment all the time. Like, it is okay to be single. Like, you don't have to be with someone. It's okay to be single. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who wrote this passage we're just reading, this was a letter to the church in Colossae. As he wrote this letter, another letter he wrote, he even talked about how it can be a blessing to be single, that people have the opportunity to not have a divided heart, that they can have even more time to be focused on God. And so if you are single, you don't have to feel bad about that. You know, some people try to find a relationship, and it ends up being a situation where they're kind of wrap all their hopes and dreams in another person, where their whole identity gets wrapped into this other person. And that's not healthy either. That brings some of that crap that we've been talking about in our relationships, because we put all of our hopes and dreams and identity on another person, and a relationship is two imperfect people, and then everything can come crashing down. And so, like, you don't have to have a relationship or be in a relationship for the wrong reasons. Like, it's okay to be single. And as we're going through this today, maybe you're thinking about getting married down the line. If that's the case, maybe today as you kind of look at this as like, here's some maybe red flags to look out for, or here's some maybe green flags to look out for. But it's okay to be single. You don't have to be married. And so maybe today isn't specifically for you, but I think there's still insight to gain from today. But as we're talking about marriage and families, we just read that passage from Colossians 3, 5 through 16. The next verse 17, says, whatever you do, do it all for God. And then in verse 18, let's look at this. Here's what it says in verse 18 through 21. It says, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and don't be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will be discouraged. So here we see this passage in Colossians that we've been looking at all month long. A couple verses after that, it talks about the role of husbands and wives. It says, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. It talks about kids, listen to your parents, obey your parents. That not only is pleasing to them, it also pleases God. And it talks about fathers there. And notice it talks about two things about men as husbands there. It talks about don't be harsh with your spouse, and don't be mean and embitter your kids. It's like these are our two negative aspects we see in these verses, and it's both geared towards men in the relationship. As we are thinking about this passage in Colossians, we've been talking about there's like negative things we want to rid ourselves of and positive things we want to add to our lives. And here we see here, it's like, guys, we got to especially pay attention to this. There's two warnings, and they're both geared towards the guys. And so we might need to pay a little extra attention today. And, these are just a couple quick, short verses. And there's some bigger concepts that we got to look at. This is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. He wrote another letter to the church in Ephesus, and it has a lot of similar concepts that what we just read here in these three verses, but he expounds upon them a little bit. So let's take a look at this. In Ephesians chapter 5, let's take a look at here. Here's what it says, starting in verse 21. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For your husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, in which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husband, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing through the water, through the word, and to present her to himself as the radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one who has ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does for the church, for we are the members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must also respect her husband. Now, last week we talked about the end of there, right? We talked about two becoming one flesh, and one of the things we mentioned is that if we want that part of our relationship to work out, the one flesh part in our marriage, if we want to have that be an important part, the sexual side of our marriages, that we have to also get the other part right, where we respect our husbands and we love our wives. Like, that is an important part. The non-physical things are important to make the physical things work well too. So we talked about that a little bit last week. But also, another thing we talked about last week was, this whole passage is really interesting because it talks about husbands and wives, and all of a sudden it's talking about Christ and the church, and it's talking about two becoming one, and all of a sudden it's talking about Christ and the church again, because this marriage union is supposed to be a reflection of our relationship with God, of how we become one with him in spirit. And so this is throughout the scripture like a sacred thing, our marriages. It's a thing where we can see it reflects this relationship with God. God is often referred to his people when they don't follow him as adulterous. We see in the Old Testament even, like, there was this prophet who married a prostitute, and it was a way to show them that they were adulterous people. And we see, like, Jesus is referred to as the bridegroom, and the church is the bride. And so there's like this union of things. And so we see this picture over and over again. So our marriages should be a reflection of our relationship with God. It should be a reflection of his love. And so we want to get this right. And so how do we get it right? Well, let's go back to the very first verse we read there in Ephesians 5. It starts out and it says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And that's really the beginning part. Submitting to one another. You know, some people will say marriage is 50-50, but actually divorce is 50-50. That's when you split things this way and that way. Marriage is really about 100-100, about giving yourself, 100% of yourself to your spouse. That's when marriage works, when we submit to one another. See, when we start to think about it as 50-50, where you give some and you take some, the natural bent for all of us is that we are selfish people. And so what happens is that we feel like we never get as much as we give, and we begin to focus all on what we're not getting, and then we begin to get upset, and we bring all this crap into our relationships. Relationships really only work when it's 100-100. See, if two people are willing to give of themselves to meet the other person's needs before their own needs, to love and care for that other person before themselves. When two people do that, then each other's needs are being met. Then each other feels the important part of the relationship because each of you are giving in the relationship. It begins with submitting to one another. Notice that verse says this, though: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Not submit to one another because they deserve it or they don't deserve it, and that's why you're not doing it. Like, that's, again, where a lot of the crap comes in these relationships. If you're withholding something, I'm not going to buy her flowers until she does blah, blah, blah. Or I'm not going to do this until he does blah, blah, blah. If we start acting like that way, where we're submitting out of reverence to their actions, man, our relationships will get off. This says, submit, give yourself away to each other. Why? Because of God's grace and mercy and his love towards us, may our lives be a reflection of that. That's where it begins. Not doing it because they deserve it, because, again, your spouse, you signed up to be annoyed by this person the rest of your life. They're going to be snoring in bed. They're going to do things you don't want them to do. They're not going to load the dishwasher the way it should be loaded, all these things. And then all of a sudden, if it's all based upon their actions and we're only submitting to them if they do things the way we want them to, man, our relationships will get so off. Marriage is 100, 100. We've got to give of ourselves. And then it goes on to talk about wives. And it says, wives, submit to your husbands. And it talks about the husband as the head of the wife. And I know for some people, that doesn't sit well. And that they're like, wait a minute, what? And what this doesn't mean is that husbands can treat your wife as a doormat. That's not what this is saying. When it talks about husbands being the head of the household, it's really more like the husband is the captain of the team. You're all on the same team, but he's the captain. But really what it comes down to here is that God holds men more accountable than he does women. That men have more responsibility in God's eyes for the direction of their families and their lives. I'll give you an example of this. Last week we looked at Adam and Eve and the story in the garden at the beginning. In the beginning, there was this tree, and God said, don't eat of this tree. You can eat of the tree of life and all these other things, just don't eat of this other tree. And what happens? Eve decides to eat of the tree, the woman, and then she gives it to her husband, and then he eats of it, and so they both did the wrong thing. She did it first, and then he did it. And then God comes to the garden to see Adam and Eve, and he already knows what they did wrong. But what does he say when he comes to the garden? Does he say, Eve, I saw what you did first? No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, Adam and Eve, come, where are you guys? No. He says, man, Adam. He holds the man responsible first for the direction of this relationship. In God's eyes, men have more accountability, more responsibility for the direction of our marriages and our lives. We even see that in the role, if you go on to talk about, if you go on to look at when it talks about the men's responsibility, the husband's responsibility to his wife, there's a level of accountability there that isn't on the women, but God sees the man as more accountable, more responsibility for the direction of their marriage and of their lives. And so when it's saying that he is the head, what it's saying is that he has more responsibility to God in that, for the direction. And so it says, wives, submit. And that word submit, again, doesn't mean you're a doormat. If we look at the last verse, it talked about to respect your husband, to give him the respect that he needs. And so that's really what it's referring to. It's not talking about submitting like you need to do everything that he says. It's not saying husbands, as the head, you make all the decisions by yourself. It doesn't say anything like that. You're a team, and he's like the captain of the team. But it's talking about submitting to your husband. And then it says, husband, love your wives. And that might seem like they get off easy. Well, he just has to love me. That seems like easy, right? But again, what we see is a picture here. It says, love your wife like Christ loves the church. That's a much deeper love. That's sacrificial love. How did Jesus love us as the church? He gave his life on the cross. He gave it all. He gave up his life. And it calls husbands to love your wife in that same kind of way, to give up yourselves for her benefit, to care for her, to build her up, to feed and care for her like you would your own body, right? And so this is what it calls the husband to do, to love in this sacrificial love. And I think maybe a way to think about this is to make it maybe a little more meaningful, a little more understanding of it, is to maybe throw it in reverse a little bit. If you're a wife, maybe the question is, are you loving your husband in such a way that you're worth dying for, that you're worth him giving up it all for? Husbands, are you someone who's worthy of your wife's respect? That really changes the perspective of it, I think. Husbands, are you worthy of your wife's respect? She's supposed to submit and respect you. Are you worthy of that? Are you living that way? Wives, are you worth your husband giving up everything for you? Are you living that way? See, the interesting thing is that you look at psychology and you look at the study of kind of the basic needs of people in relationships. So even all the psychological studies show that while this is maybe a little general and things can be shifted a little bit because personalities are different, a wife's basic need in a relationship is for safety and security. And a husband's basic need in a relationship is significance. And it really goes right along with what we see here in Scripture. If a husband's need is significance, what it says is, wives, treat your husbands with respect. Don't talk down to him. Don't tell him he's doing it all wrong because he's not doing it the way you want him to do. Don't badmouth them in front of your friends, in front of your other family, because those things don't bring respect. He needs significance. If you respect him, he feels significant. It's the basic need, according to all psychology and according to the Bible we see here as well. And husbands, your wife needs safety and security. She needs to know that you are willing to lay down it all for her, to know that no matter what happens, that you're with her. And so this goes right along with how God designed us, what we see in psychological studies. And this is the way that relationships work, to live this way, where a wife is respectful of her husband and a husband loves his wife in a sacrificial love. It goes on to talk about, if we go back to that verse in Colossians, it talked about husbands and wives. Again, we see that in Colossians chapter 3. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Again, we saw that out of reverence for God. And it says, husbands, love your wives, don't be harsh with them. Then it goes on to talk about children and parenting. And the interesting thing is that we see that in Colossians, we see it again in Ephesians. We just read the end of Ephesians 5. Ephesians 6 begins with this. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and you will enjoy a long life. So God thinks it's important to obey our parents, and he even gives a promise with them. And then it says, fathers, don't exasperate your children. Again, in Colossians, it talked about that same kind of thing. And here we see it again. Don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Colossians said, don't embitter them. Here we see, don't exasperate them. See, as a dad, we can be maybe a little harsh at times, right? Maybe that's just like a man's way. Maybe your dad never showed emotion. Maybe your dad was the one who was always like my way or the highway, or maybe your dad was someone like that, and then you tend to maybe act in that same way. And what we see here, it says, don't exasperate your kids. Don't be so hard and harsh on your kids that you will discourage them. And it says instead, bring them up in training and instruction of the Lord. Now, I see these passages we've been looking at in Colossians chapter 3, it's talked about clothing yourself with compassion and gentleness and kindness and patience. And as a guy, those aren't always our qualities, right? We're not soft around the edges sometimes. Some are, some aren't. A lot of us aren't. And that doesn't mean you have to check your masculinity at the door. That doesn't mean you need to act all oh, it's okay. It doesn't mean that. What it's saying is just don't be a jerk. Actually listen to your spouse, your kids, and don't be harsh with them. Don't be mean, don't be a jerk. Actually have a little patience and be kind. You don't have to be so rough around the edges. But it doesn't mean you have to check your masculinity at the door. It just means don't be such a jerk at times, because we can tend to be that way. I know I can be that way. It says don't be so harsh with them. I think a good thing to remember here is something we had someone from Winning at Home, a psychologist came in and did a parenting course a couple years ago, 8 years ago, and he said this, and I won't forget it. He said, be more concerned about who your kids are becoming than what they're doing. Be more concerned with who they're becoming than what they're doing. We see in this verse is don't embitter them, but train them up in God's ways. And really what it's saying, for us as parents, we can get so focused on the rules and how they need to do it this way or that way. They need to do it our way. And we can get so focused on following rules that the relationship is just all about rules and rule following. This says we got to pay attention to who our kids are becoming. Give them opportunities to shape who they are, to make their own decisions so that one day they can leave and succeed on their own. So it says to think about who they're becoming more than what they're doing. I think as a parent, that really helped me to consider that they don't always have to do it the way I think they should. They don't always have to follow it exactly the way I said it, but are they actually shaping who they're becoming? And we really want to shape them in God's ways so they can become all that they were created to be. So don't be harsh and embittering our kids, but focus on who they're becoming. Marriage and family and all of these things can be so hard and challenging, like we said. It can be one of the most rewarding things we do in life and one of the most challenging things to do in life. So do you want the secret to make it all work? If we want the secret to make our families work, whether it's with our marriages or with our kids, this is the secret. It's found in Colossians 3, we've been reading all month long. Here's the secret to make your marriage and families work. Clothe yourself with compassion and kindness and gentleness and patience. Rid yourself of all that other crap, sexual immorality, lust, greed, slander, anger, malice, lies. Like, get rid of all of that junk and clothe yourselves with these things of God. Let his peace be in your hearts so it doesn't come out in your so the chaos doesn't come out into your families. Let his words dwell in you so that he's shaping who you're becoming. Bind it all together with his love. See, this is the point, to let God's love and his ways fill our life so it overflows to our families. There's this picture, we call it the marriage triangle. We've showed this many times throughout the history of the journey. It's really making God the focus of our life and our relationships and our homes. To say, like, he is the head of our relationships. And see, what happens is when we begin to follow his ways, when there's more of God in our lives, what happens is as you grow closer to God, you actually grow closer together. See, we see this in the picture there. You can see that as they get closer to God, they get closer together. But this is how it works, is that as you grow closer to God, his love, compassion, kindness, patience, it fills your life, and then you begin to respond in that way. And then when two people are doing that together, they're actually then submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. His love is binding it all together, and you're growing closer together because you're responding the way that God designed us to. I think this is the real secret to making it work. I hope for you, in your families, in your marriages, that you will have God's blessing in such a way that his love fills your life and your relationships. That you can experience his compassion, his patience, his kindness in such a way where you won't be harsh with your spouse or your kids. Instead, you will train them up in the way they should go so that they might leave and succeed one day. That you might love your wife in such a way where she feels safe and secure. That you might respect your husband in such a way where he feels significance. That you will submit to one another and give of yourselves, and you will experience God's blessings through all of that. Let's pray together. God, as we think about marriage and families today, it's so challenging. This is the most rewarding part of our lives. It's also the hardest because it's always there. And we're there for better and for worse. And so we need you, God, to give us the strength and the focus to continue to push on in this in such a way where we don't add more crap to our relationships. But we can have a family and a marriage that's based in your love. But we need your love to fill our lives and overflow. I just think of someone right now, in this room, I'm sure there's someone who's struggling right now in their marriage. May you work your hand. May you bring healing to that marriage. May it begin with healing of each other's hearts. I know there's parents right now struggling with their kids. May you give them patience and guidance through all of that, God. May your blessing be upon our lives and our relationships and in our homes. May our homes be focused on you. In your name we pray. Amen. I invite you to stand as we respond with a couple songs. This first one is really just a response of, I want to make room for God in my life, in my family. Let's just make this our prayer.